The front office barely looked up when Caleb Morris walked in. The bell had already rung. Students were pouring into classrooms, backpacks slung low, voices echoing through the halls of Riverton High School. The secretary slid a clipboard toward him without meeting his eyes. "Room 214, she said. "English, Mr. Halverson called in sick." Attendance sheets clipped to the desk. "Just keep them busy. Just keep them busy." Caleb nodded. He always nodded. He was tall, black, early 30s, dressed neatly but without the polish of a full-time teacher. Brown sweater, pressed slacks, worn leather shoes. He had subbed at dozens of schools over the past 2 years, long enough to know the tone that came with those instructions. Don't expect much. Don't ask for much. Don't make waves. He signed his name on the line marked substitute and picked up the room key. As he walked down the hallway, students passed him without a second glance. A few slowed, curious. One whispered, "That's the sub." Another snorted. Caleb heard it all. He always did. Room 214 was already loud when he opened the door. Chairs scraped, someone laughed too hard. A paper airplane skimmed the back wall. The students barely noticed him at first. When they did, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Smiles that weren't friendly, posture that said easy day. Caleb set his bag down calmly. "Good morning," he said. A few voices echoed it back in mockery. Someone in the back clapped slowly. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He wrote his name on the board instead. "Mr. Morris, that's not our real teacher," a boy near the window said loudly. Caleb turned and smiled gently. "That's true," he said, "but I am yours today." More laughter. He glanced at the lesson plan left behind. 2 worksheets. Busy work, nothing that mattered. Mr. Halverson hadn't expected learning to happen today, just survival. Caleb closed the folder. "All right," he said, still calm. "Let's try something different." That got their attention. Not silence, but curiosity. A girl in the front row raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Caleb leaned against the desk. "Before we do anything else," he said, "I want you to write down one thing you've never been asked in a classroom." Groans filled the room. "This a trick?" someone asked. "No," Caleb said. "Just write." They didn't believe him, not at first, but eventually pens moved. Some students stared at blank pages. Others wrote quickly, like they'd been waiting. Caleb walked the room quietly, glancing over shoulders without commenting. After a few minutes, he stopped near the back. "Who wants to share?" he asked. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, a boy with his hood half up raised his hand. "Why nobody ever asks what we're good at?" he said, eyes still on his desk. The room shifted. Another student spoke up. "Why we gotta read books about people who never look like us?" A girl near the door added, "Why teachers assume we don't care?" The laughter didn't come back. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct grammar or redirect emotions. He let the answers sit in the open air of the room, heavy and real. When the bell rang 20 minutes later, no one moved. Caleb glanced at the clock, surprised. "You can go," he said. They gathered their things slowly. As they filed out, one student paused at the door. "You coming back?" he asked. Caleb smiled. "That depends," he said. "On whether they ask me." The student nodded, thoughtful, then disappeared into the hallway. Caleb packed up his bag, unaware that in the front office, a counselor had already received 3 emails from students in room 214, all saying the same thing. The substitute actually listened. No one at Riverton High understood yet what that meant. But the school would soon learn that ignoring a quiet substitute had consequences, because one lesson, given without permission, had already begun changing everything. By the next morning, the emails had multiplied. They didn't sound like complaints, which is what the administration was used to. They sounded like confusion, students asking if the lesson from the day before was going to continue, if the substitute was coming back, if they were allowed to talk about the things they'd written down. The assistant principal skimmed them quickly, then flagged them for later. There were always more urgent things: a fight in the cafeteria, a parent angry about grades, test scores due to the district, a substitute asking students how they felt did not rank high. Caleb, meanwhile, was back in his small apartment, grading nothing, planning nothing, because substitutes weren't paid to plan. He drank his coffee slowly and reviewed the mental notes he'd taken from the class. The boy with the hood, the girl who talked about books, the quiet anger that wasn't disruptive, just ignored. He had seen it before, in other schools, in other rooms, in himself. When his phone rang that afternoon, he almost didn't answer. Unknown number. "This is Riverton High," a voice said briskly. "We need a sub again tomorrow. Same room. No greeting, no feedback." "Will Mr. Halverson be back?" Caleb asked. "Not yet," the voice replied. "Can you do it or not?" Caleb paused for half a second. "Yes," he said. The next day, room 214 felt different before he even spoke. Students were in their seats, not perfectly, not quietly, but waiting. Someone had written his name on the board already, spelled wrong, but close enough. Caleb set his bag down and looked at them. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," several voices answered, real this time. He didn't start with instructions. He started with a question. "Yesterday," he said, "you told me things you're almost never asked. Today, I want to know what happens when you are." He handed out blank sheets of paper. "Pick one thing you said yesterday," he continued, "and write the lesson you wish school would teach you about it." A boy near the back frowned. "Like, we make the lesson?" Caleb nodded. "Exactly." There was hesitation, then movement, pens scratching, pages filling. A few students whispered, then stopped on their own. Caleb moved through the room, reading over shoulders again. One student outlined a lesson on budgeting because no one at home had time to explain it. Another designed a unit on writing music lyrics. Someone else mapped out a discussion on how to read contracts because people get taken advantage of. When Caleb asked them to share, hands went up. The bell rang too soon again. This time, the students groaned. At lunch, the English department chair stepped into the classroom, arms crossed. "I'm getting a lot of noise about what you're doing," she said. Caleb met her eyes. "Is it a problem?" She hesitated. "It's unconventional." Caleb nodded. "So are the students." She almost smiled. Almost. By the end of the week, students from other classes were asking if they could sit in room 214 just for the period. A guidance counselor stopped Caleb in the hall to say a student who never spoke in class had asked for help choosing electives for the first time. Still, no one officially acknowledged him. Until Friday afternoon, when the principal asked Caleb to stop by his office. The principal's smile was polite, practiced. "Mr. Morris," he said, gesturing to a chair, "we've had some feedback." Caleb sat. "Some parents are concerned," the principal continued. "They say their kids are coming home emotional." Caleb nodded slowly. "Learning can do that." The principal studied him. "You're a substitute," he said. "Your role is to maintain continuity, not redefine curriculum." Caleb didn't argue. "I understand," he said. The principal leaned back, satisfied. "Good, then we're clear." Caleb stood to leave. As he reached the door, the principal added, "Of course, test scores in that class went up this week." Caleb turned. The principal cleared his throat. "Just something we noticed." Caleb smiled gently. "When students feel seen," he said, "they usually try harder." He left the office before the conversation could be closed again. What no one in administration admitted yet was that something had already shifted. The students were asking different questions. Teachers were noticing engagement they couldn't explain. And a quiet substitute, meant to be temporary, was becoming the standard students compared everything else to. Riverton High had ignored him at first. Now the school was beginning to realize that going back to normal might be the hardest lesson of all. By the third week, Riverton High no longer knew what to do with Caleb Morris. He was still listed as a substitute, still paid by the day, still given lesson plans that assumed nothing meaningful would happen. But Room 214 had become a problem in the way administrators hated most, quietly, without breaking any rules. Students were staying after class to talk. Discipline referrals from that group dropped to 0. Absences went down, grades went up, and none of it fit into the boxes the school knew how to manage. Teachers began stopping by the door, just to observe. Some stayed longer than they meant to. One veteran teacher admitted, in a whisper, that she'd never heard certain students speak before this month. Another asked Caleb what training program he'd come from. "I didn't," he said. That answer made people uncomfortable. The district sent a representative after noticing the data. A woman in a sharp blazer sat in the back of the room with a tablet, watching Caleb teach without lecturing. That day, students were leading a discussion on power in language, how certain words were policed while others were excused, and who decided the difference. Caleb barely spoke. He guided when necessary, asked clarifying questions, let silence do the heavy lifting. After class, the district rep approached him. "You're not following the pacing guide," she said. "No," Caleb replied. "I'm following the students." She pursed her lips. "That's not how accountability works." Caleb nodded. "That's why it's working." The real tension came when Mr. Halverson returned. He stood in the doorway of Room 214 on a Monday morning, coffee in hand, staring at the board where students had written discussion prompts from the previous Friday. His jaw tightened. "What is this?" he asked. Caleb stepped aside. "What they've been working on." Halverson skimmed a few papers left on desks, reflections, essays, thoughtful, structured writing from students he had spent years trying to keep quiet. "This isn't the curriculum," Halverson said flatly. "No," Caleb agreed. "It's learning." Halverson looked past him at the students, who had gone silent. "You can go," he said to Caleb. "I've got it from here." Caleb nodded. He packed his bag slowly, deliberately. As he reached the door, a student stood up. "Wait," she said. "Are we just done?" Halverson frowned. "Sit down." Caleb turned back to the class. He didn't undermine the teacher. He didn't contradict him. He just said, "What you learned is still yours." Then he left. That afternoon, 12 students went to the counselling office together, not to complain, to request a schedule change. They wanted to be placed in classes that teach like Room 214. By the end of the week, parents began calling, then emailing, then showing up at school board meetings, asking why a substitute had done in 3 weeks what the system hadn't managed in years. The administration scrambled for language. They called it an anomaly, a disruption, an emotional outlier, but the data didn't care about their explanations, and neither did the students. Caleb returned to subbing at other schools, carrying the same calm presence, the same questions, the same refusal to treat kids like problems to be managed. Everywhere he went, the pattern repeated, quietly, predictably. Riverton High tried to move on, but the students couldn't. They had seen what school could feel like, and once you learn that, going back to being ignored is no longer an option. The quiet substitute was gone. The lesson he left behind was just getting started. The school board meeting was scheduled for 90 minutes. It lasted 4 hours. Parents filled every seat and lined the walls. Students sat on the floor, backs against the windows, notebooks in their laps. Teachers stood in the back, arms crossed, watching a system quietly lose control of a narrative it had never meant to start. Caleb Morris was not there. That made it harder. One by one, students spoke. Not angrily, not dramatically. Clearly, they talked about being listened to for the first time, about reading entire books instead of excerpts, about writing essays they cared about instead of guessing what the teacher wanted, about feeling smart instead of managed. A senior stood at the microphone and said, "I didn't know school could sound like people talking to each other instead of at each other." A parent followed. "My son stopped skipping class. Whatever that man did, why aren't we asking how to do more of it?" The board members shifted in their chairs. They asked about credentials. They asked about standards. They asked about risk. No one asked about results, until the superintendent finally did. She cleared her throat and said, "Test scores in room 214 increased across every metric during Mr. Morris's placement." Silence followed, the kind that comes when an argument runs out of air. A week later, Riverton High announced a pilot initiative, student-led discussion blocks, curriculum flexibility, professional development focused on listening-based instruction. The language was careful, sanitized, stripped of names. Caleb Morris was not mentioned, but the structure was his. Months passed, the pilot expanded, discipline referrals dropped school-wide, attendance improved, teachers who resisted quietly began borrowing techniques they'd once dismissed. Students started expecting to be asked what they thought, and didn't easily accept classrooms where they weren't. One afternoon, Caleb received an email forwarded through a counselor. It was from a student he remembered, the boy with the hood. It read, "They changed my schedule. They said it's because of policy, but I know it's because you showed them we could do more. I just wanted you to know." Caleb sat with the message for a long time. He never returned to Riverton High as a substitute. He didn't need to. The district offered him a role later, consultant, trainer, curriculum advisor. He accepted on one condition: he would never be introduced as the solution. "Let the work speak," he said. Years later, new teachers at Riverton were told about a shift that had happened around the time of the pilot. They were trained to ask different questions, to wait longer before filling silence, to trust that students often rose to the level of expectation when someone bothered to set it. Very few knew it started with a quiet substitute who closed a lesson plan and opened a conversation. But the students remembered. They carried the lesson forward, to college classrooms, to workplaces, to rooms where their voices once again risked being ignored. And when that happened, they remembered what one man had shown them without raising his voice. That being quiet does not mean being empty, that authority does not require volume, and that sometimes the most permanent change comes from someone the system never planned to keep. They had ignored the quiet substitute, and in doing so, they let him change the school forever.